The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield like a blade. Lieutenant Colonel Kira, Venom, Thorne sat in the briefing room, her weathered hands wrapped around lukewarm coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The voice that emerged from the speaker carried the kind of desperation that made seasoned pilots straighten their spines. Any station, this is Neptune 6 Actual. We are pinned down in grid 41 Romeo Papa 77. Heavy contact. Request immediate close air support. How copy? The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Three other pilots exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from concern to something approaching fear. The grid reference meant nothing to most people, just numbers and letters on a map. But to those who knew the Hindu Kush Mountains, it meant everything. The Devil's Throat, they called it. A narrow canyon where aircraft went to die, where the walls rose so steep and close that even helicopters struggled to maneuver. Major Rick Kowalski leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. No way. Not in that terrain. The canyon's barely 200 meters wide at the mouth, maybe 50 at the choke point. You'd have to thread the needle between granite walls with thermals that'll flip you upside down before you knew what hit you. Captain Devon Torres nodded grimly. Even if you got in, how do you get out? It's a dead-end canyon. You'd have to pull a 180 turn in space that doesn't exist. The radio crackled again, more urgent now. Neptune 6 Actual to any CAS platform. We have wounded. Taliban forces have us surrounded on 3 sides. Canyon wall to our backs. Request immediate assistance. Thorne set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. The ceramic clicked against the metal table, a sound that somehow carried more weight than it should have. Her gray eyes, the color of storm clouds, studied the topographical map spread before them. 43 years old, 21 years in the Air Force, and more combat sorties than any other A-10 pilot in theater. Yet when she spoke, her voice carried no arrogance, only calm calculation. "What's the ceiling?" she asked quietly. "Venom, don't even think about it," Kowalski warned. "That canyon is suicide for anything with fixed wings." She traced her finger along the contour lines on the map, following the serpentine path of the canyon. Her mind was already calculating angles, wind patterns, the weight of ordnance versus fuel, mathematics of survival written in the language of physics and desperation. "The SEALs are dying," she said simply. The radio dispatcher's voice cut through their debate like a knife through silk. "All available CAS platforms, be advised. Neptune 6 reports enemy mortars have found their range. They estimate 15 minutes before position is overrun." Thorne stood up, her flight suit rustling in the sudden quiet. Outside, the first pale fingers of dawn were reaching across the Afghan sky, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Somewhere in those peaks, American warriors were counting down their last minutes on Earth. "I'm taking it," she announced. Kowalski shot to his feet. "Venom, listen to me. That canyon has claimed 2 Apache and a Cobra in the last 8 months. The physics don't work. The space doesn't exist. You can't turn an A-10 in that narrow corridor." Thorne was already moving toward the door, her helmet tucked under her arm. Her boots echoed against the concrete floor with measured, determined steps. She paused at the threshold, silhouetted against the growing dawn light. "Then I guess we're about to find out what's possible," she said, and walked into the morning that would define her legacy. The A-10C Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its angular lines and ungainly proportions deceiving the untrained eye. To most observers, it looked like something cobbled together from spare parts, a flying tank that seemed to defy every principle of aerodynamic beauty. But Thorne saw poetry in those harsh angles, grace in that brutal functionality. She ran her hands along the aircraft's titanium-armored belly as she conducted her pre-flight inspection, her fingers tracing panels and checking connections with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon dominated the aircraft's nose, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that could fire 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate that turned enemy armor into scrap metal and regret. Crew Chief Martinez appeared at her elbow, his brown eyes troubled behind safety glasses. "Ma'am, I heard about the mission. That canyon." He shook his head. "My grandfather flew Corsairs in Korea. He always said there's a difference between brave and stupid, and the line's thinner than most people think." Thorne secured a weapons panel and looked at the young sergeant. Martinez had been her crew chief for 8 months now, and she'd grown to respect his mechanical intuition almost as much as his honesty. "What does your gut tell you about the bird today?" "She's solid, ma'am. Engines sweet as a lullaby, hydraulics perfect, cannon bore-sighted and ready to sing. But—" he gestured toward the mountains, where the peaks were beginning to catch the first real sunlight of the day. "It's not the aircraft I'm worried about." She climbed the ladder to the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat that had become as familiar as her own skin over thousands of flight hours. The instrument panel glowed to life as she ran through her startup sequence, each switch and dial a note in a complex symphony of preparation. Radio chatter filled her headset as other aircraft reported their status across the base. Bagram Tower, Venom 2-1 requesting immediate departure, emergency CAS mission. Venom 2-1, Bagram Tower. Be advised, we show multiple aircraft declining the Neptune 6 tasking due to terrain constraints. Her hands never paused in their movement across the controls. Roger Tower, Venom 2-1 is accepting the tasking. A pause on the frequency, then Venom 2-1, good hunting. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with a rising whine that vibrated through the airframe and into her bones. She advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the aircraft strain against its wheel chocks like a war horse eager for battle. The ground crew pulled the chocks and gave her the thumbs-up signal. As she taxied toward the runway, Thorne caught sight of Kowalski and Torres standing outside the operations building, watching her departure with expressions she couldn't quite read. Concern, certainly. Respect, perhaps. And something else, the look people wear when they're watching history unfold, unsure whether they're witnessing triumph or tragedy. The runway stretched ahead, a ribbon of concrete pointing toward mountains that held secrets and danger in equal measure. She lined up on the center line and pushed the throttles to military power. Venom 2-1 rolling. The accelerated with deceptive sluggishness, its heavy frame gathering momentum like a freight train finding its rhythm. At 150 knots, she pulled back gently on the stick, and the aircraft lifted off with the graceless determination that had made it legendary. Banking left toward the mountains, she climbed into a sky painted with the colors of dawn and possibility. Behind her, Bagram Airfield fell away like a memory. Ahead lay the Hindu Kush, ancient and unforgiving, where mathematics met courage and only one would survive the encounter. The radio crackled, Neptune 6 actual to inbound CAS. Our situation is deteriorating rapidly. Multiple wounded. Request your ETA. Thorne checked her navigation display, calculating time and distance with the precision of a mathematician and the urgency of a soldier. Neptune 6, Venom 2-1. ETA your position 12 minutes. Hold fast. 12 minutes to rewrite the rules of physics. 12 minutes to prove that sometimes the impossible was just another word for untested. The mountains grew larger with each passing moment, their jagged peaks reaching toward her aircraft like fingers of stone and time. Somewhere in those shadows, American warriors were fighting for their lives, counting on her to thread a needle that might not have an eye. She adjusted her heading 2 degrees east and pushed the throttles forward, chasing the horizon toward destiny. The terrain below changed gradually from the relatively flat expanse around Bagram to the increasingly broken landscape of the Hindu Kush foothills. Thorne's eyes swept continuously between her instruments and the ground, reading the land like a book written in stone and shadow. Every ridge, every valley, every terrain feature was potential cover for enemy forces or navigational hazard that could end her mission before it truly began. Her radio crackled with an update from Neptune 6. Venom 2-1, Neptune 6 actual. Enemy forces are maneuvering for final assault. We've identified approximately 40 combatants with RPGs, machine guns, and what appears to be at least one mortar team. They've got us bracketed. Neptune 6, Venom 2-1. I'll need your exact position marked when I arrive. Smoke if you have it. Roger, Venom. Yellow smoke ready on your call. The mountains loomed larger now, their morning shadows creating a patchwork of light and darkness across terrain that had humbled armies for centuries. Alexander the Great had struggled here. The British Empire had bled here. The Soviet Union had died here, one helicopter at a time. Now it was her turn to test herself against peaks that cared nothing for human ambition. Her navigation system showed the Devil's Throat approaching rapidly. She reduced power slightly, beginning her descent toward the canyon entrance. Below, the landscape transformed into a maze of steep-walled gorges and knife-edge ridges that would challenge the most experienced mountain pilot. The canyon itself appeared on her screen as a thin red line snaking between towering walls of granite. Neptune 6, Venom 2-1. I'm approaching your position from the south. Pop smoke. Venom Neptune 6, yellow smoke out. She spotted it immediately, a thin plume of yellow marking the SEAL's position deep within the canyon. The sight made her breath catch in her throat. The walls were even closer than the maps had suggested, rising almost vertically for over 1,000 feet on either side. The canyon floor was perhaps 30 meters wide at the SEAL's position, narrowing to what looked like an impossible bottleneck further north. Jesus, she whispered, then keyed her radio. Neptune 6, I have your smoke, stand by. Banking right, she began a wide orbit around the canyon mouth, studying the terrain with the intensity of a chess master analyzing an opponent's defense. The problem wasn't just getting into the canyon, it was getting back out. The walls were too steep for a normal climb-out, and the canyon ended in a box formation that left no room for error. But there was something else. Studying the topographical features, she noticed a slight widening about 2 kilometers into the canyon, barely visible on her instruments but potentially enough space for what she was considering. It would require precision flying beyond anything she'd attempted before, but it might be possible. Neptune 6, Venom 2-1. I'm going to make a low pass to identify enemy positions. Keep your heads down. Roger, Venom. Be advised, enemy forces are on both canyon walls as well as the floor. They've got interlocking fields of fire. She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods protected foolish pilots, and banked left toward the canyon entrance. The A-10 responded to her touch like a faithful horse, its controls firm and precise despite the challenging terrain. As she approached the canyon mouth, the walls seemed to reach up toward her aircraft like hungry jaws. The canyon swallowed her whole. One moment she was flying in open sky with the vast expanse of Afghanistan spread below, and the next she was threading through a corridor of stone that blocked out half the world. The sensation was claustrophobic and exhilarating simultaneously, like flying through the throat of some ancient geological beast. Her altitude dropped to less than 200 feet above the canyon floor as she followed its serpentine path deeper into the mountains. The walls rose on either side, close enough that she could see individual rock formations and the occasional stunted tree clinging to impossible ledges. The A-10's engines echoed off the granite surfaces, creating a thunderous roar that filled the narrow space with sound and fury. Contact front, came the urgent call from Neptune 6. Venom, we have multiple muzzle flashes on both walls. They're lighting us up. She could see it now, the yellow smoke still rising from the SEAL's position, and the telltale sparkle of automatic weapons fire from positions carved into the canyon walls. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site well, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the narrow canyon into a killing funnel. The SEALs were trapped in the bottom, using what little cover they could find among the scattered boulders. Neptune 6, keep marking your position. I'm making my attack run. Banking slightly left, she lined up on the first cluster of enemy positions. Her thumb found the cannon trigger and she took a deep breath. The GAU-8 Avenger was about to speak, and when it spoke, mountains listened. The first burst lasted exactly 2 seconds, 60 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium that turned a machine gun nest into dust and memory. The sound inside the canyon was indescribable, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very walls themselves. Brass casings tumbled from the aircraft like metallic rain, glinting in the morning sun as they fell toward the canyon floor. Direct hit, Neptune 6 called. Western wall position neutralized. But there were more positions, and the canyon was getting narrower. She could see the bottleneck approaching, the section where the walls closed to less than 50 meters apart. Physics dictated that she should turn back now, climb out of the canyon while she still had maneuvering room. Common sense screamed at her to abort the mission. Instead, she pushed the throttles forward and dove deeper into the stone throat. The next cluster of enemy positions erupted under her cannon fire, sending rock slides tumbling down the canyon walls. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past her left wing, close enough that she could see the vapor trail in her peripheral vision. The Taliban fighters were getting desperate, and desperate men with anti-aircraft weapons were dangerous to everyone. Venom, this is Neptune 6 Actual. You're taking heavy fire. Recommend you egress and come around for another pass. She was already past the bottleneck, the walls so close she could have reached out and touched them if she'd been foolish enough to try. Ahead lay the wider section she'd spotted on her reconnaissance, her only hope for turning around. But first, she had to deal with the mortar team that was bracketing the SEAL's position. Neptune 6, I see your mortar problem. Stand by. The mortar position was perfectly placed on a ledge about halfway up the eastern wall, protected by an overhang that would make it invisible to conventional attack aircraft. But the A-10 wasn't conventional, and neither was its pilot. She rolled inverted, pulling the aircraft into a knife-edge turn that brought her cannon to bear on the previously untouchable target. The Avenger spoke again, its voice echoing off the canyon walls like thunder trapped in a bottle. The mortar team simply ceased to exist, their position marked by a brief cloud of dust and debris that settled quickly in the mountain air. Outstanding, Neptune 6 shouted over the radio. Mortar team destroyed, you're cleared for egress. But egress was the problem. She was now at the end of the canyon, facing a wall of solid granite that rose straight up for over 1,000 feet. The wider section was just ahead, but it was still barely 100 meters across, not nearly enough space for a conventional turn. She would have to do something that no A-10 pilot had ever attempted, a combat turn in impossible space, relying on the aircraft's unusual flight characteristics and her own skill to cheat physics one more time. Hold on to your helmets, boys, she whispered, then pulled back hard on the stick and rolled into the most dangerous maneuver of her career. The A-10 responded to her command with the grace of a ballet dancer and the power of a sledgehammer. She pulled the aircraft into a climbing turn so tight that the G-forces pressed her deep into her ejection seat, her vision narrowing to a gray tunnel as blood drained from her head. The canyon walls blurred past her wingtips, so close she could see individual pebbles embedded in the ancient stone. For a moment that lasted forever, physics hung in the balance. The aircraft's nose tracked across the canyon mouth, seeking the escape route that mathematics said shouldn't exist. Her airspeed bled off rapidly as she traded velocity for altitude and direction, the twin engines screaming at maximum power as they fought to keep her airborne. Then, impossibly, miraculously, she was pointing back toward the canyon entrance. The A-10 had completed a turn that should have been impossible, threading the needle between walls that had claimed aircraft with far better power-to-weight ratios. She was alive, the SEALs were saved, and somewhere in the back of her mind, She could hear her instructor from flight school saying that the only impossible missions were the ones nobody had tried yet. Neptune 6, Venom 2-1. Canyon cleared, you should be able to extract now. Roger Venom, and thank you, you just did something we'll be talking about for the next 50 years. She climbed out of the canyon into open sky, the mountains falling away beneath her as she gained altitude. Behind her, the Devil's Throat looked peaceful and quiet, giving no indication of the drama that had just played out in its depths. But she knew that word would spread quickly through the pilot community. Someone had finally flown the impossible canyon and lived to tell about it. As she turned toward Bagram, the morning sun painted the Afghan landscape in shades of gold and possibility. Somewhere below, a SEAL team was preparing for extraction, their lives saved by a pilot who had refused to accept the word impossible. The radio crackled with a new voice, Kowalski, calling from the operations center. Venom 2-1, this is Ops. We're tracking your egress. Status report. She looked back one more time at the mountains that had tested her and found her worthy. Ops, Venom 2-1, mission complete. Neptune 6 is secure. And, she paused, searching for words to describe what had just happened. And I think we need to update the training manuals. The flight back to Bagram should have been routine, but word of the impossible canyon run had already spread across the military communication networks like wildfire. Her radio came alive with voices from aircraft across the theater of operations, pilots who had heard fragments of the story and couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. Venom 2-1, this is Hawkeye 7-7. Did you really just fly the Devil's Throat? Venom Python 3-4 here. We heard you made a 180 inside the box canyon. Is that accurate? Venom 2-1, Ghost Rider lead. Requesting confirmation. Did you actually turn an A-10 in a space smaller than a football field? She answered them all with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the mission. But inside, she was beginning to understand that she'd crossed a line that morning. She'd moved from being just another skilled pilot to becoming something else entirely, a legend in the making, whether she wanted the title or not. The Bagram Tower controller's voice cut through the chatter. Venom 2-1, Bagram Tower. You're cleared for straighten approach, runway 03. Be advised, the entire base is following your return. As she approached the airfield, she could see them. Hundreds of personnel lining the flight line, maintenance crews emerging from hangars, pilots and crew chiefs standing in small groups, all watching the sky. Word had spread with the speed that only military communities could achieve, and everyone wanted to see the pilot who had flown where angels feared to tread. She touched down with her customary smoothness, the A-10's main gear kissing the runway with barely a chirp of rubber. But as she taxied toward the parking area, she noticed something unusual. Aircraft on the ground were flashing their navigation lights, a rare salute reserved for extraordinary circumstances. Martinez was waiting by her parking spot, his face split by the widest grin she'd ever seen. As she shut down the engines and the turbines wound down with their characteristic whine, she could hear something else, applause. Hundreds of people were applauding her return. She climbed down from the cockpit on shaking legs, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade and leave her with the full realization of what she'd just accomplished. Martinez grabbed her helmet bag and looked her in the eye. Ma'am, I've been turning wrenches on combat aircraft for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. That canyon has been claiming aircraft since before I was born. Before she could respond, Kowalski and Torres were there, their expressions completely changed from the concern and skepticism she'd left behind. Torres was actually grinning, shaking his head in amazement. Venom, we monitored the whole thing on radar. The computers couldn't track you once you entered the canyon. The return was too scattered by the terrain. We thought, he paused, swallowing hard. We thought we'd lost you. Kowalski was more direct. That was either the most brilliant piece of flying I've ever witnessed, or the luckiest. Either way, you just proved that the impossible is just another word for not yet attempted. The crowd of personnel was growing, and she could see officers and enlisted personnel from every unit on the base gathering around. Word had reached the command structure too. She spotted Colonel Patterson, the base commander, making his way through the crowd with what looked like a mixture of pride and disbelief on his weathered face. But it wasn't the crowd or the attention that affected her most deeply. It was the radio message that came through on her personal frequency as she walked toward the debriefing room. Venom 2-1, this is Neptune 6 Actual. My boys wanted me to pass something along. She stopped walking and keyed her radio. Go ahead, Neptune 6. They said to tell you that you've got a beer waiting for you in every SEAL team bar from here to Virginia Beach. And his voice took on a different tone, quieter and more serious. And they wanted you to know that 3 of those boys have daughters at home. They'll grow up because of what you did today. That was when it hit her, not the technical achievement or the impossible physics, but the human cost of failure and the precious weight of success. 3 children would have their fathers come home because she'd refused to accept the limitations that others had placed on the possible. As she walked toward the debriefing, the crowd parting before her with a respect she'd never experienced before, Kira, Venom, Thorne realized that her life had just changed forever. She'd entered the Devil's Throat as a skilled pilot and emerged as something more, a symbol of what could be achieved when courage met competence at the intersection of impossible and necessary. The debriefing room was packed beyond capacity, with officers and analysts from every intelligence agency represented on the base. What had started as a routine combat mission had become a case study in aerial tactics that would be analyzed and discussed for decades to come. Colonel Patterson stood at the front of the room, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light as he called for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, what we witnessed this morning represents a fundamental shift in our understanding of close air support capabilities in extreme terrain. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, would you walk us through your tactical decision-making process? She stood at the front of the room, still wearing her flight suit, and looked out at faces that held expressions ranging from awe to skepticism to professional curiosity. Intelligence officers had their notebooks ready, fellow pilots leaned forward with technical questions written on their faces, and senior leadership wore the careful masks of people trying to determine whether they were dealing with brilliant innovation or dangerous recklessness. The tactical situation was straightforward, she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd maintained throughout the mission. Friendly forces were pinned down in terrain that conventional wisdom deemed unsuitable for fixed-wing close air support. The choice was simple: attempt the impossible or watch American warriors die. A hand shot up from the back of the room. Captain Jennifer Walsh from the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing's Intelligence Section. Ma'am, our terrain analysis indicated that the canyon walls were too close for any aircraft larger than a helicopter to maneuver safely. How did you overcome the basic physics of the situation? Thorne pulled up the mission footage on the main screen, showing the canyon from her aircraft's perspective. The room fell silent as they watched the walls close in around the A-10, coming so close that individual rocks were visible in perfect detail. The key was understanding that the A-10 isn't bound by the same limitations as other aircraft, she explained, pointing to specific moments in the video. Its unique design characteristics, the high-mounted engines, the large control surfaces, the exceptional low-speed handling, create opportunities that don't exist with conventional fighters. Major Samuel Chen from the Air Force Weapons School raised his hand. Ma'am, the turn radius calculations still don't support what we're seeing. Even with the A-10's capabilities, the geometry should have been impossible. She nodded, acknowledging the validity of his concern. The turn wasn't executed in conventional horizontal space. By combining a maximum performance climbing turn with the canyon's natural updrafts and the aircraft's ability to operate at extremely low airspeeds, I was able to use three-dimensional space that doesn't appear on standard tactical calculations. The room erupted in quiet conversation as pilots and analysts processed the implications of what she just described. She'd essentially rewritten the tactical manual for close air support in extreme terrain, proving that the boundaries of the possible were more flexible than anyone had imagined. Colonel Patterson called for quiet. "Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, I need to ask the uncomfortable question. Was this calculated risk assessment or," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "or did you get lucky?" She met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would shape not just her own career but potentially influence future training and tactics for years to come. "Sir, it was calculated risk based on 21 years of flight experience, detailed terrain analysis, and thorough understanding of aircraft capabilities. Could it have gone wrong? Absolutely. Did I have alternatives? None that would have saved those SEALs." A new voice spoke from the side of the room, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the base's chief flight surgeon. "Venom, I've reviewed your medical files. You've logged more combat hours than any other A-10 pilot in theater. Some might argue that level of experience could lead to overconfidence." The room tensed. This was the question everyone had been thinking but nobody had wanted to voice. Was this brilliant tactical innovation or dangerous cowboy flying that happened to work out? Thorne was quiet for a long moment, considering her response. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Doc, overconfidence is thinking you can do something because you've done similar things before. What I did this morning was different. I calculated the risks, understood the consequences of failure, and made a conscious decision that the mission requirements outweighed the personal danger." She turned back to the main screen, pointing to the canyon footage. Every pilot in this room has faced that moment where the book says one thing and the situation demands another. The difference between a good pilot and a dead pilot is knowing when to trust your training and when to trust your judgment. The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from the technical aspects of extreme terrain flying to the psychological factors involved in making split-second decisions under combat stress. But gradually, the tone of the discussion shifted from skeptical analysis to professional respect. As the debriefing concluded, Patterson stood again. "Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, on behalf of everyone in this room, I want to thank you for redefining what we thought was possible. Your actions today didn't just save lives. They expanded our understanding of air power capabilities in a way that will benefit warriors for generations to come." The applause that followed was different from the crowd outside. This was the quiet, professional recognition of peers who understood exactly how difficult and dangerous her achievement had been. As the room emptied, Thorne found herself standing alone with Martinez, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room. The young crew chief approached her with something approaching reverence in his eyes. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with her as the adrenaline faded completely. "How did you know you could do it? I mean, really know?" She looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his face the same hunger for understanding that had driven her throughout her career. "Chief, I didn't know I could do it. I only knew I had to try." The mess hall that evening was unlike anything she'd experienced in 2 decades of military service. Word of the morning's mission had spread throughout the entire base, and as she entered with her flight suit finally exchanged for standard duty uniform, conversations stopped and heads turned. But this wasn't the uncomfortable attention of celebrity. It was something deeper and more meaningful. She'd barely sat down with her dinner tray when the first approach came. A young Air Force lieutenant, fresh-faced and nervous, approached her table with the careful deference of someone meeting their hero. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the 83rd Expeditionary Rescue Squadron. I was wondering." She paused, gathering courage. I was wondering if you could tell me how you developed the confidence to attempt something that everyone else said was impossible. The question struck her more deeply than she'd expected. She gestured for the young officer to sit, recognizing something in her eyes that reminded her of herself 20 years ago. The hunger to prove that women could excel in roles where they weren't always welcome. Lieutenant, confidence isn't about believing you can't fail, she said, cutting into her reconstituted roast beef. It's about preparing so thoroughly that when the impossible becomes necessary, you're ready to attempt it. More officers approached throughout the meal, not seeking autographs or selfies, but asking serious questions about career development, tactical decision-making, and the mental preparation required for high-stress combat situations. She realized that her morning's work had transformed her into something she'd never intended to become, a role model and mentor for an entire generation of military aviators. But it was the conversation with Master Sergeant Patricia Williams from the 455th Maintenance Group that affected her most profoundly. Williams was a 28-year veteran who'd worked on everything from F-16s to B-52s, and her weathered hands and knowing eyes spoke of decades spent keeping aircraft mission-ready. "Colonel, I've been turning wrenches since before you were flying," Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "I've seen a lot of pilots come and go, but what you did this morning," she shook her head. "You didn't just save those boys. You proved something to every woman in uniform." "What's that, Sergeant?" "You proved that excellence doesn't care about gender, age, or what anybody else thinks is possible. You proved that when the chips are down and lives are on the line, competence is the only thing that matters." As the evening wore on, Thorne found herself at the center of a dozen different conversations, all revolving around the same theme. The morning's mission had transcended tactical success and become something more significant. It had become proof that the boundaries of the possible were more flexible than anyone had realized. But it was the email that arrived on her personal account at 2200 hours that truly brought home the scope of what she'd accomplished. The sender was Admiral Sarah Mitchell, the Navy's first female four-star admiral, and a woman Thorne had admired from afar for years. "Kira," the message read, "I heard about your canyon run through channels I can't discuss. What you did today will be studied at every service academy for the next 50 years. More importantly, you've shown a generation of young women that there are no limits to what they can achieve with proper preparation and the courage to act when action is required. Well done, pilot. The sky is proud of you." She stared at the screen for a long time, the weight of recognition settling on her shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked for but found herself honored to wear. Outside her window, the lights of Bagram twinkled against the Afghan night, and somewhere beyond those lights, the mountains waited with their ancient patience and their newly expanded possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to push the boundaries of what aircraft and pilots could achieve together. But tonight, for the first time in her career, Kira Venom Thorne allowed herself to feel proud of what she'd accomplished and excited about what might come next. The canyon had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was time to see what the rest of the world might offer to a pilot who refused to accept limitations as permanent conditions. 3 days after the canyon run, the media attention began. It started subtly, with a brief mention in Stars and Stripes about a successful close air support mission in challenging terrain. But by the end of the week, major news outlets had picked up the story, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the female pilot who'd flown where others said it couldn't be done. Thorne found herself pulled from regular flying duties and assigned to what the Air Force euphemistically called public affairs support, a series of interviews and appearances designed to showcase American military competence to both domestic and international audiences. She hated every minute of it. The first interview was with a Pentagon correspondent from CNN, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Martinez, who'd built her reputation on asking the questions that military personnel preferred to avoid. They sat in a sterile conference room at Bagram, cameras rolling as Martinez prepared to dissect the mission that had already been labeled the Devil's Throat Run by military bloggers worldwide. Colonel Thorne, critics are saying that what you did was unnecessarily reckless, that you put yourself and your aircraft at risk for what amounts to a publicity stunt. How do you respond? She looked directly into the camera, her gray eyes steady and unblinking. Ms. Martinez, 8 American warriors went home to their families because of that mission. If saving American lives is considered a publicity stunt, then I suppose I'm guilty as charged. But surely there were other options. Helicopter extraction, perhaps, or waiting for improved weather conditions. The SEALs had wounded personnel and were under active mortar fire. They didn't have time to wait for improved conditions, and the terrain made helicopter extraction impossible under enemy fire. The choice was simple: attempt the mission or watch good people die. Martinez leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. Some of your fellow pilots have gone.